This is Bloomberg Equality. I'm Scarlet Fu.
And I'm Romaine Bostick. This June, we've broadened our coverage of markets and the economy to take an all-inclusive look at what social equity and equality truly mean for companies, for investors, and ultimately for our collective global prosperity. We're going to go deep into several key topics. That includes the impact of the election here in the U.S., as well as the variance and nuance of equality initiatives around the rest of the world.
So that's where we start today, with global equality gaps. From Africa to Asia, we'll examine the growing disparity in LGBTQ rights, as well as ongoing fractures in gender equality. Now, the varying rules and regulations across governments is making its impact on the corporate world, with some companies forced to adapt operations. We'll explore how firms are finding ways to maintain the rights of users and workers. Highlighting the divergence in rights, Thailand is on course to become the first nation in Southeast Asia to guarantee marriage equality. This past week, the country's same-sex marriage bill cleared its final hurdle with the Senate. Romaine?
Yeah, and we're going to take a sort of this all-inclusive look at this really around the world here. There is an inclusiveness index out there. It takes a variety of factors, including race, gender, sexual orientation, even disability, to come to a conclusion as to just how inclusive certain countries are. You can see the countries right now at the top of that list: New Zealand, Portugal, the Netherlands, Slovenia, and Iceland. Don't necessarily see the U.S. in there, but we are ranked pretty high. And then, of course, you have the flip side of that. Those are the countries that are on the lower end of that spectrum. You see a lot of countries in Asia as well as in Africa, including Burkina Faso and South Sudan. And this is one of those areas I think we really want to tackle today, Scarlet, really just how we have that type of divergence from country to country and region to region.
Okay, so let's see how it applies to companies specifically. Grindr is the world's largest LGBTQ-focused dating app. However, it does face restrictions in places like Indonesia, Qatar, and Malaysia. We spoke to Grindr CEO George Arison on tackling the intricacies of maintaining their users' rights.
In other places in the past, we actually shut down people's ability to create new accounts because we were seeing evidence of people creating accounts even though they were not going to be long-term users. They were just joining to harass our users in that country. And so shutting down temporarily the ability to create accounts was a way to limit that until that situation was resolved. But obviously, there's always more that we want to do. One of the big things we're thinking about is how do we engage the governments that are supportive a lot more, whether that's the U.S. government or European governments, to try to help us in places where there are challenges. That's something we're working on with the hire that we're looking for now to head up our government affairs, because there's a ton of opportunity for Grindr to partner with governments that are supportive to advocate for people in countries where they're not supported in the way that they should be.
I am curious, George, about how you protect the data that you have collected. I mean, we talk a lot about some of these incidents, which are very much in the here and now. But let's say a year from now, someone is detained, their phone is searched, and that data is available to that government or to those authorities in some way or another. Have you guys thought about ways that maybe there is a way to either anonymize or to protect that data in some way from these sort of forced breaches down the road?
Yeah, so Grindr gives a lot of control over privacy to our users. We don't require you to have a photo. We ask you minimal information about you before you create an account, and that's on purpose. We actually, on purpose, don't do verification of a person's identity because so many of our users are discreet. Even in countries where acceptance is very high and tolerance is very high, a significant portion of our users choose to be discreet. Overall, about 30% of our users are choosing to be discreet for a variety of reasons, right? It could be political kind of challenges that you might face in that country and legal ones, or it could be purely that, hey, I don't want people to know that I'm on Grindr because of my job, and I'd rather stay discreet. So we make privacy a really big deal for our users because it is, and it's a matter of life and death for some of them. We also don't share any of your information with advertisers, which is obviously damaging to us from the revenue perspective, but we think it's really important because it protects users' privacy more. A lot of our users say, hey, can I have better ads in the app versus what I'm seeing? But a big reason why you don't see better ads is because we share so little information about you with third-party ad providers. So that's something we already take extremely seriously, and that is a really big deal for Grindr. Being privacy forward is something we've very much prided ourselves in because our users need it, and ever since I've been here, that's been a really big focus for us as as well.
What type of questions have your users asked of you or asked of the company, particularly in response to some of these issues in countries where either you have explicit laws against this type of sexual behavior or even implicit laws that could potentially get them in trouble as well?
Yeah, so we actually oftentimes think about, should we stay in some of these countries or not? That is a question that comes up quite frequently because, you are there, but there's a lot of risk in being in that country. And what we hear from both users and NGOs in a lot of these places is that they would really prefer us not to leave. And if even more than that, in some of the countries where we don't operate, we have gotten requests coming in from users or potential users and nonprofits, activist groups in those countries saying, hey, can you please come into this country, even though you are not there today? Which to me, when I first joined Grindr, was a surprise. Like, I did not expect that. But what you hear ultimately is this is one of the few ways in which people can connect in this country, even though it's a really difficult place to live. And so we want you there because that is more important than the risk associated with being in that country or being on the app in that country. And so that's something we've heard a lot from users, and we take a lot of solace in that. And it's really awesome to be as important to users as we are. But obviously, we also take really seriously that we need to be really careful with what happens in those countries and try to help users as much as we can.
Yes, there's investors, but you have to depend on banking partners. You have people that work to help build your product. How has that been in the US and abroad?
Totally. That's been more interesting and surprising, frankly. When I was thinking about taking this job, my husband would warn me that, hey, you're going to experience things that you have not experienced before in business. And I was like, come on, in today's day and age, that should not happen. But it's been really surprising to see how much more kind of homophobic behavior there is and how it shows itself. With banking partners, for example, some banks have been amazing. We refinanced our debt last year, and JP Morgan led that process. We had 4 other big banks join them, and that was really amazing for those banks to put their money where their mouth is, and they're all very supportive in terms of kind of pronouncements and policies to our users at their corporations, and then for them to come around and also become our lenders, I think was really awesome, and I'm really happy about that. But at the same time, we did see a bunch of banks drop out of the process along the way for inexplicable reasons. And ultimately, I think that kind of how people perceive us had probably something to do with that. Now, that's in some ways depressing. On the other hand, it motivates me to do a better job in communicating our story and getting more people to understand what we do and why we're an awesome company to support.
George Arison there, the CEO of the dating app Grindr. A great conversation here about a lot of the cross-border issues that his company has to deal with in order to protect the privacy and the rights of its users. One particular country, though, that has been in focus, that has been clamping down on rights, is the West African nation of Ghana. Its parliament passed a bill that seeks to punish people identifying as LGBTQ with as many as 3 years in prison. Outright International, it's an advocacy group that tracks human rights abuses primarily related to sexual orientation and gender identity. It condemned the action, saying, quote, it will have severe and detrimental effects on the lives and freedoms of LGBTQ individuals in Ghana. Joining us right now is the executive director of Outright International, Maria Sjödin. Maria, great to have you here on the program. I wish it was under better circumstances, but when I look at a law like this, and I think this doesn't just apply to the folks who are in Ghana at one particular time, but even Ghanaians who are maybe traveling abroad, and if they're found to be engaging in behavior that violates this law, they can face repercussions.
Yeah, this is one of the aspects of this law that makes it really one of the most horrifying proposals in the world right now, and that is in the context where we see a lot of countries implementing these kinds of laws that go way beyond the sort of colonial era bans on same-sex relations into much more around identity or advocacy and infringing on people's freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and all basic human rights, really.
There's also sort of the overarching tone that this sets as well. Even if somebody doesn't find themselves within sort of the legal confines of breaking this law, there is a tone here that homosexuality, certain types of gender identities just aren't acceptable. And I would think that that would also bring certain repercussions outside the bounds of legality.
Yeah, I mean, this law was proposed in 2021. And Outright launched a research program together with Ghanaian groups at the time to document what was the effects of a law that at the time had not even been introduced in Parliament. And what we documented was that we saw an increase in violence. We saw people being arbitrarily arrested. Under a law that at the time didn't even exist. We saw people being exposed to blackmail, losing their housing, really a lot of very severe consequences. And I think this is also, we've also seen this in the case of Uganda, for example, that has a somewhat similar law, that it's not necessarily just what the state wants to do and how they want to implement the law. The effects of the law are much more wide-reaching than that, and has a very severe effect on people living there.
Right, and you can see right now we have a map there showing African nations with LGBTQ plus jail terms, and it really speaks to how neighboring countries' policies may be influencing each other. You have Gabon, Angola, and Botswana that have decriminalized homosexuality, but then on the other hand, Kenya, Namibia, Tanzania, and Niger are considering introducing legislation that deepens anti-homosexual discrimination. And then, of course, you mentioned what happened in Uganda. Can you talk a little bit more about Uganda specifically, because in 2014 they passed that legislation and then subsequently it was altered. Parts of it were revoked.
Yeah, so in 2014 the law was actually overturned on technicalities. And so in the last couple of years it's been reintroduced and then passed last year. And we have called this currently the worst anti-LGBTQ law in the world. And we consider this to be a law that's based on genocidal ideology. So it's not just about banning particular things that people do. It's really about trying to erase a minority from the country in its entirety. And I think that is one of the things that we're seeing with some of these laws now, that they go so much further than punishing same-sex relations. It's really much more about the way that you're allowed to express yourself. And one of the things that was overturned, there is an ongoing court case really in Uganda, but the Constitutional Court removed the provision that everyone had a duty to report people. But that is a provision that does exist in the Ghanaian law as it stands. So really, if you know someone who is LGBTQ, you are supposed to report them. And actually, in the worst situation in the Ghanaian law is it actually would apply to allies too. So it's like it's criminalizing a lot of people in society, just trying to really erase LGBTQ people.
Now, so far, this has not been signed into law by the current president, though I believe his term ends at the end of this year, so it's not clear what will happen next. In terms of the history of this bill, a lot of people are saying it can be traced back to a U.S.-based organization.
Yeah, so the World Congress of Family, which is a U.S.-based designated as a hate group at Southern Poverty Law Center, they held a conference in Ghana in 2019. And so it was after this that this bill was introduced. And, you know, it was clear from what was known at the time that the anti-LGBTQ was high on their agenda. And I think this is what we're seeing. This isn't just something that's happening in one country or another. Like, countries are clearly inspiring and looking to each other for inspiration when it comes to these laws. And I mean, that's why we haven't just seen this in Africa. We've seen Russia pass similar laws, Iraq. Like, we have seen many places in the world pass these kinds of very far-reaching laws that have a huge impact.
I am curious. I mean, particularly when we talk about some of these U.S. groups that have been involved in this, but even some of the groups that are maybe more homegrown to those countries, the argument that they've made is that the U.S., the West overall, is basically forcing our values on them. That basically just because we may feel we want to be more inclusive for all people doesn't necessarily mean that they have to. How do you respond to that?
I mean, first of all, LGBTIQ people exist everywhere in the world and have since the beginning of time. And I mean, there are around 65 countries that criminalize same-sex relations. And that was actually mostly the British Empire that during colonization imposed this on countries. And so I would say that it's actually the homophobia and transphobia that has been, unfortunately, a very successful export of the West. And the way that we work at Outright is always to work in partnerships with groups in country. And clearly, people need and should have their rights everywhere.
Maria, thank you so much for joining us today. Maria Sjödin is Executive Director of Outright International. Now, coming up, we're grappling with gender inequality. We turn our attention next to Japan. This is Bloomberg Equality on Bloomberg Television.
This is Bloomberg Equality. Companies in Japan are lagging behind those in other countries in attempts to narrow the gender gap. According to the World Economic Forum, Japan ranks 118th out of 146 countries in closing that gap. Japan also has the complicating factor of having one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. Scarlet?
Well, this is clearly a global trend. It's not limited to Japan. You look at fertility in OECD countries, and in this chart, it's in white, and the U.S., which is in green, and everything is largely moving down and to the right. Now you look at Japan, which is in pink. Its fertility rate, which reflects the average number of children that a woman is likely to produce over her lifetime, has not been above 2 in almost 50 years, since the mid-70s. And in 2023, the fertility rate dropped to a record low of 1.2. So, enter public policy and entrepreneurs. The governor of Tokyo has pledged to subsidize the cost of epidurals and expand free childcare to firstborn children, while a number of startups are tackling infertility issues.
All right, joining us now to talk a little bit more about this is Anna Katanika, Bloomberg Equality Global Executive Editor. And Anna, try to draw the link for us between the ability, or I guess the desire to close that gender gap, and some of the fertility issues that Scarlett was just talking about.
Japan has some very strict laws around access to fertility treatment still. So at the moment, unmarried couples aren't able to access IVF and other reproductive assistance programs. So single women, for example, aren't allowed to use donor sperm to have children by themselves through IVF. That's something that's been called into question in Japan, whether that's sustainable, especially considering the demographics of the country is in such dire straits right now. But there are also other measures to try and counter the demographic decline. At 1.3 million births per woman and an ongoing decline, ongoing record lows in fertility, the government there is very much scrambling. They've thrown billions at various programs, and right now they're also focusing on IVF and how to subsidize the cost of IVF. Tokyo was one of the areas where they did allow some subsidized IVF programs, and that was met with, they were overwhelmed with the number of women that wanted access. Thousands of people applied, far more than they had places for. And also to fill the gap, a lot of private companies, some startups are starting to pop up, seeing if they can improve the situation, trying to make access to reproductive health care smoother and faster for them. But it's not just Japan, obviously. A lot of Asian countries, a lot of developed countries are facing this sort of similar problem. So on the Equality team, we're looking very much at what governments can do to try and reverse this phenomenon, but also what the private sector is doing and how they're trying to capitalize on this as well.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of the private sector, we know that U.S. companies are continuing to push back against DEI, whether it's no longer drawing attention to their efforts to actively dismantling whatever programs they had put in place. What are the global ramifications? What are you finding as you and your team do your reporting?
Well, it's been almost exactly a year to this date since affirmative action was overturned at this U.S. Supreme Court. And Edward Bloom, the activist conservative lawyer who was behind the affirmative action case, has turned his attention to DEI in the corporate world and academia as well. And that's really lit the fire in the U.S. pushback against DEI. A lot of these conservative groups are launching legal attacks against corporations for their diversity programs. We reported earlier this year on how Wall Street firms are rolling back some of their diversity programs, either opening up internship programs that were meant for marginalized people to everyone. Companies also removing or changing the language around DEI or removing DEI from executive pay. In terms of how that's impacting across the world, it's a slightly different situation. We are seeing more of this sort of war war on woke movement in Europe, there has been a shift to the right, especially as we saw with the European parliamentary elections.
Yeah.
France is a place that we're monitoring with Marine Le Pen gaining power there to see what kind of risks to marginalized groups could come through. But in terms of the corporate impact, it's still very much a very US-focused problem for DI advocates right now.
All right, Anna Katanika, the Bloomberg Equality's executive editor down there in Washington, D.C. A closer look, Scarlet, at some of the issues, not only, of course, what we talked about a little bit earlier in Africa, but in some of the developed countries like Japan and Europe as well.
Yeah, and especially as immigration pattern changes as well. We're seeing a lot of migration into the U.S. and in parts of Europe. That's going to continue the conversation as well, because there's going to be a lot of response to what a lot of people are taken by surprise by.
Taken by surprise by, and then it goes back to the legal issues too, right? Ultimately, this isn't just about politics. This is also about laws and constitutions that, in theory, have enshrined the rights of some of these people. But we're seeing the pushback now, and it's happening from a lot of different avenues.
Yeah, we saw that, especially with what's happening in Ghana right now.
Absolutely. All right, coming up, we're going to give you our takeaways here from today's episode. Stick around. This is Bloomberg Equality.
This is Bloomberg Equality. Let's get straight into the biggest takeaways from today's show. In talking about the anti-LGBTQ law in Ghana, which punishes those who identify as LGBTQ and those who advocate for them, one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is that funding from the World Bank and IMF is in jeopardy if Ghana moves forward with this.
Yeah, this is going to be a big thing that a lot of those countries will have to wrestle with. But what about the larger companies that aren't dependent on those big global bodies like a Japan or maybe like the U.S.? I mean, let's face it, we have a big U.S. election coming up here in November that could have huge ramifications for a lot of the issues that we talked about today and on all of the segments that we've done this month of June.
Yeah, we've already seen that take place in the past year, right, with the Supreme Court ruling on college admissions, not using race as a factor, and how that's playing out across the corporate sector right now.
Yeah, so join us next week, next Thursday. We're going to continue our special coverage of Bloomberg Equality with a very specific focus on the U.S. election. What's really at stake here, and we're really going to hear from both sides here, not just, of course, those who are for this or for against it, much more balanced approach.
A lot of nuance there. Don't miss that upcoming episode of Bloomberg Equality.
All right, we'll be back next week. Thanks for joining us here on Bloomberg.